About the session, as you already heard in the introduction, I am an engineer, so it's like a design system 101 from an engineer's perspective. This is not a design first session, I would say. So because like I'm not a designer, but then since I've been working with a lot of designers as well as design system has a lot of stake in developer life cycle as well, which is why I think that this would anyway be useful if you're a developer or a designer. I am expecting that this session would be a practical introduction to design systems, and it will help you decide whether you need a design system, whether you need to work on a design system right now, whether you should create your own design system right away or just reuse some of the existing things that are available. Why should you do that? Why should you not spend time and effort on your design system? All those kind of questions is what I'm trying to answer. The first thing that we would want to discuss is what is a design system and why do you need it specifically. Like, I mean, is there a reason that any one of us should be using this design system or any design system? Then the second thing is we would try to understand what constitutes a design system, what are the different parts of the design system, whether we should actually care about all the parts simultaneously or whose responsibility is it to actually care about the different pieces. Then the third thing, we would just quickly try to understand a developer's perspective on what design systems are and how do they fit in the life cycle of a developer throughout their daily work and whatever they are doing. This is mostly from a front-end developer perspective again, because like design is applicable only to front-end devs mostly. Then the last thing we'll be discussing is how to build your own design system if you want to, and like why do I think you should not build your own design system, which is a like small opinion piece that we'll discuss towards the end. Like a design system is uh, I am not sure if you are coming with the earlier context or not, but a lot of people see design system as a component library or a style guide or some basic styles that need to be implemented. But just to clarify, a design system is much bigger than that. A design system is uh, a complete set of guidelines as well as processes that accompany those guidelines, as well as a component library or UI kit as we call it, as well as a pattern library, as well as a style guide which tells you everything about what fonts to use, what should be the weight of the text, what should be the tone of the text and everything. And overall the understanding that all these things together would give you is that it will make it much easier for you to build products with consistent and predictable user experience. Now I'm just saying it from the end user perspective, that if you as a developer or a designer are using a design system in your development process, then for the end user actually your product would feel more consistent and predictable. Now, not exactly saying that without a design system you can't do that, but we'll see why it is much easier with a design system and why it is difficult without a design system. Why does anyone need a design system? Like, I mean, this is as generic as it can get. Why does anyone need any kind of system? Like in this case, mostly the answer is it actually saves you a lot of money, because once you have figured out the reusable patterns, you can actually put them everywhere without a lot of effort. So it definitely saves money for the organization because they don't spend time reinventing the wheel all the time. It saves effort because now as a developer you can actually not put in effort, or as a designer you cannot put in effort in defining all, like let's say all the card states or the button states again and again, because it is defined once and you can use it everywhere across the product, and it actually gives you more time to work on focus things uh, like apart from the design system. If you want to work on accessibility, on the component library, all that it gives you time for. And for the end user, as we discussed, it is a predictable and consistent user experience. Now that we understand why would we need a design system, we'll just quickly go to what constitutes a design system, what are the different pieces that a design system has. If you are looking at a product, let's say if you are looking at the Twitter app or the Smallcase app or maybe any other product, you go through the product and after some time you actually already are expecting as a user that okay, if there is a new feature introduced, this is how the interaction would be. One example would be reels, right? Instagram reels is one thing where you already know and it feels very natural to you as an interaction, and which is why anywhere else you go and there is a like similar interface like reels, you know what to do, like you know how, that you have to swipe. Like having said that, design system is something which happens in the background, still there are two parts as I see to the design system, uh, which you can classify the design system into. One is the visible facade, which is like something which is still visible to end users. Uh, the first thing on that would be style guide, right? So style guide is all the visual styles that your product should have, all the brand and content guidelines or the tone of the content and everything that is part of the style guide, right? So style guide is visual styles plus non-visual styles, maybe related to text, maybe related to how the tone of your brand marketing should be and everything. Now this style guide is something which is very visible to users. For example, if you go to Twitter, you know that their like general theme is blue and white. There is a certain kind of blue that they use on as the primary color, and that is how you understand that okay, if you look at a website where you even do not know it's Twitter, but if you look at those colors, you would understand that okay, this is probably Twitter because it uses the same theme. Coming to the next thing, which is components. Components is something which is part of design system, which needs to be implemented in both design as well as development. So by components, I generally mean there is a usable component library which has all the basic components that you use across the product. So again, talking about Smallcase or Twitter, you will see that there is a certain design for the button that gets used across the whole product. Like there is a primary button, there is a secondary button, there is a tertiary button, and across the whole product it looks just similar. Like you will not feel that the tertiary button at one place is different from the tertiary button at other place, because like that is how it makes more semantic sense, and that is how the design system enables developers as well as designers to be consistent throughout. So all these components, basic components, are generally part of a component library. Depending on the kind of product you have and the kind of maturity that your product has, you might have a different set of components, but all of them are built in a manner that they are just reusable, and with some like you can control how it would render on the screen with some, like in React terms it would be props, or in other frameworks it would be something else, but you can just control how the button renders on the screen, but all the visual consistency is already taken care of by the usable component library, right? The third thing is pattern. So now that you already know what is a reusable component library, a pattern library is actually something which sits on top of the component library. So a pattern would be how does a user navigate from one page to the other, right? That is an interaction pattern, and this can also be built in a reusable manner. There are a lot of like existing centralized patterns as well. Let's say pull to refresh is a pattern, right? Uh, or this reels, the swipe to change content is a pattern. Like all of these patterns, some of them are centralized, some of them would be very specific to your product. Let's say when Tinder introduced the swipe left and swipe right, it was very specific to their product. Although swipe as a gesture is not very specific, but at least this interaction pattern was very specific. But that just became like very usual for the user as part of using Tinder, and that can be classified as one of the patterns from the pattern library that they have in their design system. The design system for your product might have a different set of patterns in your pattern library. The design system for some other product might have a different set of patterns in the library, but components are generally more generic. Like it's like every design system would have a button component, would have a card component, would have a link component, all those, right? So this is the visible part of the design system. Now, apart from these, like design system also has some what I like to call the abstract pillars, which are things that keep on happening in the background. They are not directly visible to the end user, but these are the things which actually enable the whole design system. These are the things which happen in the background even for the design system, and this is what enables you to actually have a maintainable design system, right? The first thing is processes. In a design system, there are at least 50 different processes that need to happen. For example, one of them is how does a designer introduce a new pattern or component to be used in the product. Let's say when you start building your design system, you have covered maybe 10 components, maybe 15 components, because obviously you cannot be so exhaustive. If you have not faced the use case yet, it is very difficult to solve for it. So when the designer faces a new use case, or the product figures out that has to be a new kind of interaction at some place, then there should be a process where designers can introduce new patterns or components so that developers can then implement it and make it reusable, right? So there has to be a process for that. There has to be a process for reviewing all the states of the design system or the design component which is being implemented. There has to be development process around development guidelines that okay, this is the level of accessibility that we want to achieve when this component is developed. All those things are processes which again is not visible in the foreground in the design system, but this is what enables the design system to be maintainable and to actually succeed. Then the other thing is documentation, which goes hand in hand with processes. So like you need to make sure whenever you are building a design system that there is shared documentation between designers, product and dev, and anyone who wants to understand why a certain thing is being done in a manner on the product. Then they can just go to the documentation and they can try to understand, okay, this component is supposed to be used in this manner, this pattern is supposed to be used on these pages. Let's say marketing pages have a different pattern for navigation, but product pages have a different pattern for navigation. So that is where everyone should go to, and this documentation is again something which is not visible to the end user but very very important. Then the third thing is slightly more like abstract, I would say, but there has to be a design language which binds the whole design system and the design team and the dev team, right? So just the pattern library or the component library or the style guide does not build the design system completely. There has to be a shared understanding across the whole team about what exactly is the design system and what does it mean for your product or for your brand, right? So when we talk about the design language, this is where you know that this is how we do things in the product. Let's say this is the kind of copies that we can have on the product screens. This is the kind of messaging that we send to our users on brand marketing, or this is the kind of messaging that we send to our users on push notifications, or like the type of colors that you use would make the user feel that your brand is modern, let's say, right? Or those kind of things. So there has to be a consistent design language which is a shared design language across everyone, the developers, the brand marketing team, the product and the designers. We'll talk about a developer perspective, like what is there for the developers in it, right? These are the two most important things from a developer perspective that I see, right? So as a developer, if you don't have a thought process around design system, then like still, let's say if you're working in React or Angular, you still have a component thought process that everything is a component. But what gets missed is that you don't really care that this component looks similar to that component and maybe you should standardize it as part of a design system. Unless and until you have that process, you are not actually achieving the kind of reusability that would help you make it more maintainable, because your thought process is not design system oriented. But more than that, I think what every developer tends to miss on is accessibility. So you create one component, you make it accessible, then there is a new requirement from design for a component which looks similar, but the accessibility considerations are completely different. For example, you may have a button component and you may have a tab component, and the tab, each trigger of the tab is also a button, but the accessibility concerns are very different in these cases. Like a button has a different set of accessibility things to follow, and a tab panel or a tab content or a tab trigger has a different set of things to follow. Or maybe let's say the menu buttons also look similar to your button, so you already have a component but the accessibility concerns are very different. So if you don't think about it in terms of semantic components in the design system, if you, let's say, even if you just think about it in terms of reusable components, you will definitely miss out on these things. So having a design system thought process, one, it helps you with reusability in general, not just visual reusability but also functionality and accessibility. And second, like it actually makes it very very process oriented for accessibility to happen across your component library. And once you have the design system thought process, you can actually expand it to reuse patterns as well. So that, till now, like I think anyone who is on the call, if all of you are beginners, then probably you would have worked with a component library, sure, but maybe very less number of people would have worked with a pattern library which is also reusable, right? For example, when I mentioned that uh, the pull to refresh is a pattern, for that you might have a component in some cases, but in other cases it would be like, let's say on marketing pages there has to be a button which looks different, and on product pages there has to be a button which looks different. For this you will not have a reusable pattern because it is difficult for you to codify this pattern. But if you have the design system thought process, you will actually be able to codify. So that is what I think it is in it for developers, and I think it is a very like it is something which is very, very important. In case someone is able to bring that design system perspective, great. Even if they're not able to bring it, I would say reusability is something which is still solved as a thought process by frameworks like React or Angular. So practically that might be okay for you as well. But if you just extend your approach to actually cover all the different other things which can be reusable as well, like patterns as well as styles, as well as the like maybe the tone or the copies as well, then it will work wonders for you as a developer. Now, having said that, design systems, some examples can be categorized into two two kind of design systems. One is like general purpose and one is product specific. So product specific design systems are obviously things that we would be working on when we build our own design system, but general purpose design systems are very prevalent. So it's like, especially in mobile operating systems, you would see that one particular company wants to make sure that everything is aligned to their design system. Let's say if you have worked with the Apple ecosystem, they generally want to make sure that all of the mobile apps align to their UI philosophy, and for that they have the design system, and everyone should just follow those design system guidelines, otherwise your app can also get rejected in the Play Store review. So these are general purpose, which is like somebody has published them as guidelines, somebody can create a component library based on that, and you can just use it in your design system, irrespective of whether you have a design team or someone who can give you proper designs or not, right? So this is where these general purpose implementations are more helpful. Then there are product specific implementations. One of them is like one of the very good ones or more famous ones is Polaris from Shopify, and then there is Carbon from IBM. Both of them are really good. But yeah, these are some examples for you to better understand what exactly I'm talking about when I say design system. I'm assuming out of these 4 or 5 you must have worked with or heard of one of them at least. So now we'll come to the final piece, which is building your own design system. As we discussed that there are different pieces to a design system, we'll just try to understand what tools can you use to actually build all those different pieces as a developer or a designer, right? So the more like 3 things that we discussed, which are the visible facade or the visible front of the design system. We'll just look at how you can build it, right? So style guide, components, and patterns. For style guide, you can actually build it using something called design tokens, right? So you might already be using design tokens in some form in your code. You might be using CSS variables for, let's say, all the different colors that are possible in the designs. You might be using CSS variables for all the different kind of spacings that might be allowed in your designs. You might be using CSS variables or, let's say, Tailwind or Bootstrap, some kind of config to define all the different kind of fonts or the font sizes that your product can use. So that is how the style guide is implemented. Style guide is implemented as design tokens. Design tokens can be implemented in Figma, where they become reusable and you can directly build in, bake in those two components as well. So this is for designers, and for developers they can be implemented very easily through CSS variables or Tailwind or Bootstrap or any other framework that you're following. So that is how you implement the style guide. Now the second thing is components. For components, again, as we discussed, you can either use the existing library or you can build your own component library. If you want to use existing, then Chakra UI, Bootstrap, Material UI, all of these are good examples. Then the patterns, again, as we discussed, that patterns are mostly an extension of components. So you can actually implement the patterns. Designers can do this in Figma, and these patterns can be documented in Storybook. From a developer perspective, Storybook is a tool that I think most of you might have heard of till now, at least, because it is very popular now for component design and component visual testing and all. But like designers can do this in Figma, developers can do this in Storybook, and they can add actual textual documentation around how to use a certain pattern. Again, this is something that you would generally build on your own because the patterns would be very product specific in your case. But there can be some centralized patterns as well. So some existing component libraries might be able to provide the basic pattern library as well, right? So I've just added some examples of tools that you can use: Bootstrap, Storybook, Chakra, Figma. All of these help with these 3 things for sure. Now coming to the next set of things, where we know things are slightly more difficult because these are slightly more abstract. What kind of tooling can help you with it? So again, for processes, I would say these are things which require the most effort, because setting up the process of how to introduce a new component, how to do the review of the component, or like in what format to provide the feedback and all that, that is a very manual effort for which there is literature available, sure, but there is no tooling available or a framework available easily which you can just follow, and you'll not need to do that manual effort. So process is something where definitely manual effort or manual intervention is required. So for this, I would not say that there is any tooling as such, but some part of the processes can be automated, or some part of the process can be made simpler by using some kind of tooling, right? Then the other piece is documentation. Designers can choose to do the documentation in Figma. Developers can choose to do the documentation in code directly, or developers can choose to do the documentation in Storybook, so that they can host the Storybook somewhere and it is available for the whole uh, organization to look at, right? Then on design language is mostly again manual effort, because you will need a lot of examples, because the design language is very abstract and it is very difficult to just capture in words, which is why a lot of examples and a lot of documentation on why we should do something or should not do something makes more sense, right? So for example, there would be do's and don'ts in their guidelines, that these are the kind of push notifications we would allow, these are the kind of push notifications we should not do, even if they are, let's say, uh, aligning to the other guidelines, that there should be memes or they should be witty or whatever, but there should still be some example or handbook for them to see that okay, these are the do's and don'ts. So this is again a very manual process, and this requires, I mean, practically this actually requires someone who has the vision to stay with the team or be in the team for long enough that they can define this whole thing, or they can take care of this whole thing. Otherwise it is very difficult to hand it over to someone, because there is no concrete concept behind it. So which is why design language again does not have any tooling as such. You can use whatever kind of documentation and example tools that you want. I think this is the final slide that I have, where I just have this opinion on whether you should build or borrow, which is like, should you build your own design system or you should just borrow it from some existing library. So if you're working for a mature product, if you want to solve it for your end users, then you should definitely borrow. Why? Because if you borrow, then there is a lot of things that you can get rid of in your setup, right? For example, if you just start on top of Bootstrap, then you by default know that a lot of accessibility problems are solved. A lot of base components are already available, which obviously you will not be building on your own. But even if you are building, I would suggest to build it on top of something, because they've already solved at least 10 times more problems than whatever you are solving right now. And they have solved it in the manner that where it is already reusable, it is already customizable, it is already something which solves for accessibility. So if you want to actually solve it for your end user, that is the best way to go. If you start building things on your own, then you are definitely going to miss out on some of these things. Like, you may be able to make it work visually, but then accessibility wise you may not be able to make it work because you don't have enough time or enough expertise. So like, I would say definitely makes sense if you're working for a mature product and you want to make sure that the time to market is less and your users actually get the benefit of a design system. I would say just build it on top of something else or completely borrow, because the kind of things that you can get rid of is, let's say, accessibility issues are already covered mostly, right? Coverage issues, let's say tomorrow if you are building your own design system and product says now you need to build a date picker. Now a date picker is something which is like, which takes huge effort to build if you want to build it in an accessible manner. So at that point in time, you would think that okay, it would have been better if I already had a component library which I could customize and just use the date picker from. Documentation effort is not required because Bootstrap already has a documentation, or Polaris already has a documentation. So all of those things you will save on. So this is my opinion right now. I think if you're a beginner, it would probably make sense to borrow, because the benefit that you want to provide is to your end users. If the benefit was that you get to learn a lot of things, sure, I think you can do that as a side project, that I want to build a design system on my own where I'll build a component library, I'll build a style guide and everything. Same for a designer, I think. Like, it can be a side project, but if you want to actually deliver value to your end user, it would be much better to just borrow, is what I have learned from the experiences that I have had. Like, again, since this is an opinion, it is fine to not agree, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, because this is the last slide that I have. I'll just conclude with the final slide where I have my contact details in case you want to reach out. So I'm And like as I mentioned, you can actually, or you should actually reach out to me on any of these handles, because I'm very interested in talking about these things, and I do think that I have the kind of experience that you'll probably enjoy talking about these things as well. So like feel free to reach out to my Twitter or wherever else you think.